Hi, my name is Jess Gladis. I'm an environmental studies and philosophy student in the Clark Honors College, and I've been doing research for the last year on value pluralism and environmental justice in the Nisqually Watershed, where I've been evaluating deliberative policy making using a framework called IPBES. My advisors for this project are Dr. Mark Carey and Dr. Barbara Maraca, and I'd like to start this presentation by thanking them for their time and their patience and their support in the last year of my research. So without further ado, let me introduce you to my research project. This research uses methods of environmental hermeneutics, phenomenology, and the intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, for our sakes we'll call it IPBES, conceptual framework, to assess the values that arise within and influence the outcomes of resource disputes. IPBES aims to incorporate traditionally underrepresented perspectives into ecosystem services assessment and policymaking. I am testing this framework's efficacy in accurately identifying and sorting values among stakeholders. Because of its categorical methodology, this framework may be a helpful tool in mapping out and evaluating the diversity of worldviews and motivations with respect to a meaningful resource or landscape. I hypothesized that retrospectively applying this framework to a resolved environmental justice or resource conflict can provide insights about IPBES's potential utility and applicability in contemporary ecosystem services assessments. This framework, coupled with hermeneutic phenomenological approaches, may advance a collective understanding of values as influential agents in environmental problems and their proposed solutions. My project studies how the environmental history and evolution of values within this region laid the groundwork for contemporary land stewardship practices today. Clarifying valuation's function and impact on motivations and human resource relationships is fundamental in our ability to navigate environmental problems as they intensify due to climate change. Here, this lens is applied to the Nisqually River watershed located in Washington. It's an important landscape to evaluate due to its cross-cultural land use history, its ecological contributions like salmon and steelhead, its unique geographical position, its past political and civic controversies over resource distribution and the abundance of literature representing all sides of these conflicts, and its eventual overcoming of incommensurable values to become a model of successful cooperative ecosystem services management. My research questions started off very broad and theoretical, and they really honed in on the practical aspect as time went on. But I started off by asking questions relating to being and in the environment and how it relates to glaciers. So by what processes do human beings place meaning and value on their environment? How does this in turn influence ecological decision-making and land stewardship practices? And what makes a landscape or resource charismatic or culturally valuable? Can a hermeneutic phenomenological lens be applied to glaciology, to environmental justice and dispute resolution? Do certain values correspond with specific people or interests in the literature, and how? And so to kind of answer this last question, I asked, can IPBES's general conceptual framework be applied to case studies of environmental conflict to better understand how values inform ecological decision-making, to see if there is any type of value correlations that presented themselves in the data using a certain framework? So to answer these questions, I developed a method out of hermeneutic and phenomenological traditions to test whether IPBES's proposed value categories are useful for identifying and including stakeholder-specific values. Based on IPBES definitions of instrumental, intrinsic, and relational values, I used hermeneutic methods to develop a code index to sort the interpretation of values expressed in the literature. I sorted these values based on IPBES's value domains, such as instrumental, intrinsic, or relational, the stakeholders that were articulating the values, and the institutions that influenced the expression of these values. The Nisqually River watershed spans 720 square miles in the Puget Sound region. Its headwaters come from the Nisqually Glacier at the summit of Mount Rainier, and they course into the valley until it terminates in the Puget Sound Delta. Its shared waters have attracted diverse interests from various stakeholders represented in part by indigenous tribes and governments, industry interests, and state and federal regulatory agencies. The Nisqually's 78-mile course provides habitat for several types of salmon, including threatened Chinook and coho, as well as waterfowl and other marine life like oysters. This watershed is considered nationally significant as it is the only river to have its headwaters in a national park and its delta in a national wildlife refuge. It is also the setting of a decisive success story for environmental justice and collaborative watershed management. Briefly, I'm going to explain who the stakeholders are in this study and some of the terms central to my evaluation. So we have our watershed residents. The Nisqually, Muckleshoot, and Puyallup tribes are the indigenous residents of the region. This has been their homeland for thousands of years, and so they have a long pre-established history of land relationships in this region. And then comes in the settler population about 170 years ago, and these are kind of just two of the many groups that now live in this region. And then there's also fishermen. So we have tribal fishers, settler fishers, and people with recreational fishing interests. We have industrial interests such as Tacoma Power, Wilcox Farms, and Weyerhaeuser Timber. We have the state of Washington regulatory agencies such as the Departments of Fisheries and Game, and finally the federal government also has stake here with the Army Corps of Engineers, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are just to name a few of the many entities that are invested in ecological management here in the watershed. So each of these stakeholders represent values formed by their experience and ways of being in the world. Some are rooted in a sense of cultural identity, some in financial well-being, some in aesthetic pleasure, and most importantly, all are valid and interact with each other to varying extents. Instrumental, relational, and intrinsic value categorizations may potentially help organize the complexity of motivating values by engaging them in a comparative, pluralist dialogue that mediates this equivocation. This attention to contextual analysis and relationality is informed by hermeneutic phenomenological approaches to dispute resolution. My most concrete results thus far derive from my analysis of the 1974 U.S. versus Washington ruling, colloquially called the Bolt decision, after Judge Bolt, both a beloved and loathed figure depending on which stakeholder group you should happen to ask. But the application of hermeneutics and the evaluation of this court case conveyed layers upon layers of value-laden meaning that informed the actions taken and interests expressed and defended preceding and following the decision. The Bolt decision marked a paradigm shift for Indigenous environmental justice in the Pacific Northwest. It was so remarkable in part because of the way it resolved and mediated incommensurable values in practicing an accurate, pluralist interpretation of interests and their corresponding motivating values. Further, it placed these values into a dialogue with one another via a historically oriented deliberation on treaty rights that changed it so that the settler culture could no longer legally control the dominant narrative about salmon as a resource in the region. You may have noticed that despite my expressed interest of organizing value orientations, I have yet to present any definitive results involving the IPBES assessment. As it stands, the normativity of the IPBES framework seems to limit its utility given the complexities of hermeneutic analysis. The IPBES framework is promising for unpacking and mapping deliberative processes because of the definitions and guidelines it provides for examining various valuations. But does it overpromise and underdeliver? IPBES attempts to incorporate the intricacies within questions about values, ethics, and practice into assessing policymaking and ecosystem services. While in theory, instrumental, intrinsic, and relational values can be categorized into distinct ways of viewing the world, the actual application of these categories exposes the limitations of neat conceptual frameworks in dynamic real-world conflicts. IPBES can be an organizational tool to map values, but it requires the nuance of hermeneutic phenomenology to make any tenable conclusions, is my assertion, on the complex realities about confining specific values to specific stakeholder groups. Value categories are useful because they do attempt to apply a method to the madness in this conflict analysis, but they are by design normative and therefore must be taken with a grain of salt. This normativity contradicts its expressed goal of practically conceptualizing value pluralism, by nature a very complex process or concept. As shown by the nuances present in the Bolt vignette, these categories will ultimately be transcended in hermeneutic phenomenological projects, aiming to thoroughly explore the intricate role values play in decision-making. The Bolt decision and all its controversy demonstrates the ubiquitous intertwinement of and dialogue between value categories. Even within and across stakeholder groups like the Nisqually or the Department of Game or non-tribal fishermen, one will find that their platforms, perspectives, and ways of being in the world are informed by a combination of value domains. Thus, the neat categories or definitions provided by IPBES are really most useful as mere organizational mechanisms, and the more complex project of mapping out the diversity of values held between these opposing interests and within particular groups, and also as expressed by their respective engagement with the surrounding landscapes and its resources. My study unveils the interplay between relational and instrumental values both within and between cultures, showing that values do not simply formulaically correspond with specific interest groups. These values are constantly being thrust in a conversation with one another within and across various institutions, and this reflexivity and mutability is fundamental in value formation, manifestation, and expression. Understanding this process as dynamic and inherently relational is essential in discussion and decision-making about multifaceted social issues. This case identifies how courts operate as equivocal spaces that demonstrate how instrumental values traditionally influence environmental policy, the importance of relational values in deliberative processes, and how these values interact in complex conflicts. But it is not supported with any certainty that stakeholder groups should or could be normatively associated with any specific set of values. Thank you for your time and for listening to my presentation.